So welcome to another episode of Let's Get Real. We are back. We have so much information that we talked about on the last episode. So I wanted to bring Rick Linnell back. And this time we're going to be talking about the different forms of ownership. So welcome to another episode of Let's Get Real. So thank you so much, Rick, for joining us today. I know we touched a little bit on this subject at our last episode, but there's so much information, and this is a really important factor of different types of ownership. And most people do not realize what is available, and that can get them into a lot of trouble if they're not clear as to what kind of ownership that they have or can have. So, Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back, as always.
Great, so let's dive into this. So there are different types of ownership. Can you go into the main four?
Sure. So Michigan recognizes 4 forms of ownership for real property. We have tenants in common, joint tenants with full rights of survivorship, and tenants by the entireties. I think it's important to kind of talk about each one, and then we can talk about impact and considerations for people buying real property. So the easiest one I think to talk about is tenants by the entireties. Tenants by the entireties is only available to a married couple, and they each share an undivided interest in the property. And it's particularly beneficial because if one spouse has a creditor or a credit issue, it does not impact the home. Because of the unity of marriage and this particular form of ownership, it protects against a creditor getting that home. Now, I want to be clear. Protecting meaning a creditor can't force the sale of that home. But if the asset was sold and the spouses were each to receive money, if that's what happened, then the creditor could go after that individual spouse. But it's very helpful in protecting against any kinds of creditor issues. What I think is important to also know about that form of ownership is that if, in fact, the couple decides to part ways, that ownership can be immediately broken and turned into tenants in common. And it can be broken unilaterally, meaning one spouse says, I don't want to be married anymore, and the other says, boy, I don't feel that way, I'd like to remain married. The spouse that doesn't want to be married can also cause the form of ownership to be broken, and it will become tenants in common. So the point of that is that the married couple gets the benefit of tenants by the entireties, but they're not bound by it. They can break it if they want to end their marriage. Next form of ownership is tenants in common. Tenants in common is actually the most common form of ownership. If a deed just says Rick Linnell and my brother Matt Linnell, it's assumed that it's tenants in common. It is tenants in common. Whereas if it said Rick Linnell and Terry Linnell, my wife, even if it says nothing else, it's automatically tenants by the entireties. Tenants in common is important to understand because tenants in common, you and I could be tenants in common. We each own our share. I pass away. My heirs get my share. You don't get my share. You now are a co-owner with my heirs. And of course that's significant because I'm never going to lose that asset.
Now, can the co-owners force the sale of a property? Let's say we lived at that property together and you pass away. Now your heirs own half of that house. Can they kick me out of the house and get the house sold?
That's a really good question. So there's something called partition. And partition is really the court's way of saying a forced sale. And in a tenants in common ownership property, any owner, usually it's 2, but there could be 10. Any owner can force the sale of the property, which is, of course, one could say, well, wait a minute, I don't want to sell the property. Why can someone else make me sell? I tend to look at it the other way, which is that nobody is stuck being an owner in the property if they don't want to be. Now, as a practical matter, we talk about a court-ordered sale. Court-ordered sales, they don't occur that often. What happens is one party takes the other owner to court, seeks partition. One of the parties really wants the property. Maybe both do, but at least one does. And the one that wants it typically buys out the other one. So That's the mechanism for forcing one to sell to the other, forcing one to sell to the other at market, but oftentimes one buys out the other. But rest assured, if neither party wants to buy it or neither party wants to pay fair market value, it will be sold to a third party. And what I think is valuable about that is when you own property, of course that's great, but you don't want to be bound where you can't do anything with your ownership interest.
Right.
And some of the other forms of ownership interest present those kinds of challenges.
Let's dive into those.
So the next form of ownership I think we should talk about is joint tenants.
Okay.
Now, joint tenants means that the two owners own the property, they each have free use of the property, but if one of those owners passes away, the surviving owner inherits their interest. So tenants in common, you and I are an owner, I pass away, my heirs get my ownership interest in the property. You and I own the property as joint tenants, I pass away, you now are the sole owner. And for some people that makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to get too far off topic, but we'll see people use this form of ownership as what I'll call a will substitute, or in lieu of estate planning. I will tell you this is not a good way to do it, but it does happen. Joint tenants, I pass away, as I said, you take my ownership. You and I are owners. I decide I want to sell the property. You say, Rick, I'm not interested in selling that property. I said, well, Lisa, you don't have a choice. And you say, well, we own joint tenants. If you pass away, I get it. I'm younger than you. I'm healthier than you. I'll just wait my time. And I said, no, I can take you to court. Because under joint tenancy, I can also go to court and seek a partition. And I can force the sale of the property. So I can break the joint tenancy. So I have those rights. Let's talk about the last form of ownership.
Real quick, I have a question on
Yes.
joint tenancy. So with the joint tenancy, the only way you can even get into that is if we own that property 50-50, correct?
No, we don't have to. So you and I could buy a piece of property today.
Okay.
You could put in $50,000, I put in $10,000.
Okay.
And we can own it as joint tenants.
Okay.
Now, that issue of ownership, that can be dealt with in an agreement. So we could say that I'm a 10% owner and you're a 90% owner, or whatever that is. We can take care of that. But if the deed is silent and there's no agreement, then we own it equally.
Okay.
The next form of ownership, and the last one, is joint tenants with full rights of survivorship. And joint tenants with full rights of survivorship, at its base is the joint tenants that we just talked about, and with full rights of survivorship adds a new component. So I talked about Lisa and I own the property together, I pass away, Lisa inherits my interest. I decide that I don't want to be an owner with Lisa, I can break the ownership. Joint tenants with full rights of survivorship is unbreakable. So you and I take title as joint tenants with full rights of survivorship. And I say, Lisa, I don't want to be a co-owner with you. And you say, well, Rick, I understand, but I don't want to sell. There is no selling of the property. And most people do not appreciate what this means. As a lawyer, we quite honestly see the horror stories of this and the unintended consequences of this. When people buy property, the real estate agent is not to dispense legal advice. It's against licensed law. So a realtor can't even discuss these forms of ownership and counsel in any way, even if they're very knowledgeable in this area. They're not allowed to. Title companies are not allowed to dispense legal advice. And so owners oftentimes make a guess, ask a friend, look on the internet, not the best ways to determine ownership, especially when you're talking about real property, which we're probably talking about tens, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars. But oftentimes the buyer doesn't appreciate that form of ownership. And it's very important. And the buyers have all different kinds of motivation. I was in a deposition last night. Siblings bought a property together where one sibling funded all of it, the older sibling. And the older sibling wanted the house to be used by all the siblings, picked the youngest sibling to be on title with the idea that the youngest sibling would live the longest and would be a good steward of this house when my client passed away. Well, they took title as joint tenants with full rights of survivorship. And my client didn't understand what that meant. Well, the younger sibling is not doing what they're supposed to do, not doing what they promised to do, and my client would like to break the form of ownership. And it's virtually unbreakable. As far as how people should view this form of ownership, it is unbreakable. Had a scenario where a gentleman unfortunately lost his wife. He was concerned about what would happen to his house. He had a really nice house worth well over $300,000. He owned it free and clear. He decided to add his oldest daughter to the deed. English was not his native tongue, which I think made it a little more challenging, although I have plenty of people who English is the first language who still don't understand these concepts, and rightfully so, by the way. There's no critique. And he added his oldest daughter to the deed as joint tenants with full rights of survivorship. Well, this gentleman was lucky enough to meet another woman. He got married to this woman. They came to me after 25 years of marriage, on his second marriage. And the gentleman, unfortunately, had succumbed to some various health issues where he was having very trouble moving around, trouble communicating, and wanted to sell the home. And they were going to buy a condo. And his new wife, although 25 years in, not brand new, was going to take care of him as she had been. And found out that the daughter was on the deed, and they said, well, Rick, we'd like to change this. And I called the daughter, and the daughter said, I'm not changing it. That's not my mother. You know, and I mean, you can understand how someone might feel that way in general, although I still don't agree with what happened, and that is that the oldest daughter refused to sell. Yeah. And it was unbreakable. There's nothing, and we're talking about a house that's worth well over $300,000. This gentleman needed to move into a condominium that he couldn't afford because he had equity in the house. He couldn't afford to get to a condominium. His wife, when he left this planet, was not going to get any money, and the daughter was going to get this giant windfall. And she had siblings, you know, from her mother and father, full siblings, and they weren't going to get anything either. And it was not this gentleman's intent for that to happen. But he didn't appreciate what these various forms of ownership mean. I'll tell you the most common context, well, I guess estate planning is one, but even maybe more common is cohabitation, where we have people who are not married but are committed to each other buying property together. And it's really important to talk about the form of ownership. You know, if one passes away, do they want the survivor to get the house? Do they want that to be etched in stone, like a joint tenants with full rights of survivorship? Or is it joint tenants, and if the relationship somehow doesn't last, then we're going to break it? And those nuances are never discussed with people that are entering into these cohabitation agreements, or even just partners. I mean, they don't have to have any sort of romantic relationship, they're just partners. How are we going to own this? And I think that these are really important considerations that any property owner should undertake before deciding on the form of ownership.
Yeah. So much information here. So if you guys are buying property, whether you're married or just buying it with another partner, definitely reach out to Rick Linnell. He can help you answer any questions and decide what type of ownership is right for you. So Rick, do you want to tell everybody how they can reach you?
My office number is 248-977-4182. Or you can go to my website. My website is linnellfirm.com.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show and very informative. So if you guys are looking for any real estate advice from a legal standpoint, definitely reach out to Rick Linnell at Linnell & Associates. Or if you guys are looking to buy or sell a home, feel free to give me a call and I can help you get your house sold.